Hello, hello, everyone. Happy Friday. Happy Friday. So good to see each of you. We have been expecting you. We're just giving it a moment or two for our guests to get settled into the virtual learning space, especially for those that are joining us as part of our Zoom community. We also have an audience that's building on LinkedIn Live. And so we welcome each of you, no matter how you're joining. We have been expecting you as we do every Friday this hour, and we're really excited that you are spending this time with us. We have a great program ahead, great guest co-hosts, and I cannot wait for you to have the opportunity to engage with us as we talk about a lot of different things that we know are really important to this community who cares deeply about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. This is Intentional Conversations Vodcast, where we intersect DEIB with leadership and business. And we're so glad you're here. Please take to the chat. Let us know where you're joining the conversation from. It's always a treat for us to know where people are joining the conversation from. And feel free to share anything else into the chat or the comments if you're joining LinkedIn Live that you want people to know about you. And I'll also let you know that we do have closed caption that has been made available as part of our podcast today. And that's our way of showing up and support of disability inclusion. So if you need that, know that it is available to you. Cameras today, if you're joining us as part of our Zoom community, they are encouraged, but certainly not required. We love to see smiling faces, but we know that many of you join just to listen in, and we appreciate that as well. We're going to leverage the chat today and the comment section if you're joining LinkedIn Live to help extend our sense of community with each other as we learn with and from each other. So make sure that you use the chat to share any resources, any thoughts, any sentiments that may come up for you as we spend this hour of time together. Once again, this is Intentional Conversations Vodcast, and I'm Dr. Nika White. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Welcome. Awesome. So as it was stated onto the screen, let the conversations begin. And that is exactly what we're going to do right now. So if you're just joining us, you have joined Intentional Conversations Podcast. This is a podcast that we bring to you from NWC, Nika White Consulting, where we intersect conversations of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging with leadership and business. We're so glad you're here, and we appreciate your participation. I want to just recognize that today is Cinco de Mayo. So happy Cinco de Mayo Day. It is always celebrated the 5th of May, and it is a holiday that celebrates the date of the Mexican Army's victory over France. And so while it's certainly a relatively minor holiday in Mexico, interestingly enough, in the United States, Cinco de Mayo has evolved into a commemoration of Mexican culture and heritage, particularly in areas with large Mexican American populations. So I want to acknowledge that. As we often do at NWC, we like to bring to these conversations some of the national observances for this community. And May is also Mental Health Awareness Month. And I'm seeing lots of conversations on social media about this, which is great because we need to break the stigma. We need to talk about it often, not just the month of May, but often. And so I hope that you all are getting your mental health screenings and that you're taking really good care of yourself, because that is our responsibility. That's self-care, that's self-help. And so let's make sure that we're amplifying the message that mental health is something that we all need to have top of mind. Now, May is really busy. Not only is it the Mental Health Awareness Month, and today, of course, we're celebrating Cinco de Mayo, it is also AAPI Heritage Month. And so we want to make sure that that's into your hearing. Again, seeing lots of conversations out on social media, and I hope that you're finding ways to really support the AAPI community. Let them know that we stand in solidarity with them, that we see them, they belong, they're valued, and just keep that top of mind, not just in this month, but all year round. For those of you who've been a part of our community, you know that I continue to share that I have released book number 3. It's called Inclusion Uncomplicated, a Transformative Guide to Simplify DEI. That is in partnership with my publisher, Forbes Books. It is available right now anywhere that you like to get your books, and it's in Kindle, hard copy, as well as audio. And so if you don't have it, please make sure that you get it. support. I greatly appreciate it. And if you haven't, consider going to Amazon and writing that review. Those reviews are really important once you've launched a book. Now, one of the things that we like to do before we actually jump into the day's conversations with our guest co-host is to give you a little bit of information for what you can look forward to in the weeks to come here on Intentional Conversations Vodcast. And so on Friday, May 12th, next Friday, we have an amazing guest who's going to be joining us. And her name is Rahime Ramizani, and we are going to be talking about Muslim inclusion and equitable access in predominantly non-Muslim spaces, as well as incorporating considerations of religion into existing DEI efforts. And so I hope that you will join us on that Friday. Now, the week following, we have Deanna minus Vincent. And for that Intentional Conversation podcast, we're going to be talking about why traditional DEI won't get us to the finish line and the criticality of equitable whole person approaches and what's required to create true systems change. So I hope that you will join us on May the 19th for another, what I am calling in advance, going to be a riveting conversation. Then finally, to round out the month of May, we have Tara Robertson. And by the way, if you don't know these names, I do encourage you to look them up, follow these individuals. They all have are very well respected in this space, and they all have a lot of great resources and content of value to share. But Tara and I are going to be talking about coaching for women of color and how it's a game changer, getting clear on your values as a leader in data-driven diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. And so I hope you will join us for all of these dates upcoming this month in May. Now, if you have been a part of our community, you know that I always take an opportunity before I bring on our guest co-hosts to read their official bio. This is important to me because I want people to know their accolades, their experience, the credentials in which they show up to today's conversation. And it also just helps us to have a better insight into what we can expect from this hour of time visiting with our guest co-host. And so my guest co-host today is Dr. Ann Kowal Smith, and she is the CEO and founder of Reflection Point. Reflection Point unlocks collective intelligence by guiding small groups through facilitated discussions of short stories to build bridges, flip perspectives, and deepen shared understanding. Reflection Point has worked with organizations all over the world to foster inclusion, innovation, and collaboration, and has also served as principal with Heidrick and Struggles International and strategy expert with McKinsey & Company. Prior to joining McKinsey, Ann practiced corporate and securities law in private and corporate settings and earned her AB from Bryan Mawr College, her MA from University of Michigan, and both her JD and DBA from Case Western Reserve University. Her dissertation examined organizational learning and innovation, and her work has been featured in peer-reviewed articles in journals, the New York Times, Crain's Cleveland Business, Financial Times, Harvard Business Review, and also Forbes. And she and I both learned today that one of the points we have in common is that we both are Forbes contributors. And so look forward to hearing about some of the topics that she is centering in her Forbes articles and getting you connected to how you can be exposed to those articles. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to help spotlight our guest co-host today so that she can greet you in her own way. And I've already prepared you for this, but I will lead in by sharing that while we've read your credentials and your bio, one of the other things that we like to do is also make sure that this community can hear some things that maybe we wouldn't find in your bio or even in your profile on LinkedIn that helps us just to connect and know you a little bit better. So Ann, I'm going to turn the floor over to you and invite you to greet this audience in your own way. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you, Nika. I'm thrilled to be here and delighted to be with everybody today and hope that we can have a really robust conversation. I think to introduce myself in my own way, I think one of the things that may not come through in my bio is that I'm really an idea junkie, geek, if you will. I love ideas. I love new ideas. I love learning. And I really am most excited about ideas that I come across in ways that I least expect them, right? So things that you don't necessarily think about in the same breath, or ideas that I learned from other people. And so it's exciting for me to be on a journey where I can be learning every single day.
I love that. We talk often here on the podcast, and about the importance of, no matter how experienced you may be around our, cultural humility, cultural intelligence, that we are all constantly learning, unlearning, and relearning, right? And so I share your sentiments about, I show up every Friday to this conversation, looking to learn, seeking to learn, expecting to learn. And so I'm sure we're all going to learn a lot from you today. So thank you so much and welcome again. So why don't you just share with us what your journey has been so far? It's always interesting for us to hear how people gravitated to the work of DEI and how they intersected with some of the other, maybe very specific disciplines that they find themselves offering and involved in. So tell us about your career path, and how did you transition into the work that you're doing today?
So as you could tell from the bio that you shared, Nika, my career path has been full of twists and turns, which I'm kind of proud of. I mean, I think going into it, it's always a little bit interesting to see what's going to happen on the next turn. But I think what took me to DEI, and DEI plays a major role in the work that we do at Reflection Point, has been not a place where I started, but a place where I've transitioned to. But the transition has really been an organic one, right? It hasn't been forced. So Reflection Point was always, right from the beginning, about enabling people to hear voices that they didn't necessarily hear, to stop and to realize that there's an awful lot of ideas, there are an awful lot of voices, there are an awful lot of perspectives that, for whatever reason, we tend not to hear. And so it was always about amplifying voices and helping us to each make the contribution that we deserve to make in the world. But it probably started all the way back when I was a lawyer. When I joined the profession as a lawyer right out of college and then law school, I was pretty privileged. I was pretty educated. I went into a law firm. I felt like I was, really on top of the world. And I remember multiple times when I would hit these sort of moments that left me speechless, right? So the time I worked with a bunch of older men who, on a deal where I was part of selling a shopping center, when I asked them some questions that were really specific about a transaction to sort of really understand what was happening, they looked at me and said, "Did you do this work yourself or did somebody help you?" Right? And I remember thinking, wait a minute, what's that about? Or one of my favorite moments when I had a colleague, another older male partner in a law firm, tell me that his wife had packed his suitcase on a business trip that we were on, and he wasn't sure he could pack it on the way home. And would I be willing to pack his suitcase for him like his wife did? So I remember thinking from the beginning that no matter how much of an education you have, no matter how much you have to contribute, that the way people see you isn't always the way you see yourself, right? And I thought to myself, from those days, early days on, I realized how often we underestimate people. And I think that journey of experience, as well as sort of learning and education, has helped me to say, DEI really matters. It really, really matters. And it matters very broadly. It matters for all of us because we all have something important to contribute. And until we can really clearly engage with new ideas, we are not going to be able to build the kinds of bridges that we need to tackle an uncertain future together.
No, I appreciate that, Anne. And so from one bridge builder to the next, all that you're sharing is really resonating with me. I love the name Reflection Point. As I was reading your bio, I took notice of flip perspectives, and I love that language. I'm a person that I'm big on words, and I think that I perceive that probably was very intentionally placed within your bio, and probably language that finds its way into a lot of how in which you show up to this work. And so I just want to unpack that for a second. Flip perspectives, because I often hear perspective sharing, perspective taking, right? But when we talk about flipping perspectives, what in essence are we communicating?
I think the most important piece of that expression, and why we do actually use it very is that it's very easy to get caught up in our bubbles, right? It's very easy for us to see a world through our own life experience, our own education, and to assume that what we see is in fact the truth, the reality. And that my reality and your reality and somebody else's reality are actually very, very different. And I think that it's not that there are alternative facts or that there are different truths that are out there, but that our life experience colors us in so many ways. And that if we can't open ourselves up to seeing the world through another set of eyes, then we lose the breadth, we lose the ability to learn and grow together. And so it's more than just perspective sharing and perspective taking. I think we sometimes need to literally try to stand in somebody else's shoes as much as we possibly can, and really try to understand the world that they're seeing at the same time that we look at the world through our own.
Yeah, very well stated. And you're right. When it comes to lived experiences, we can't, very precisely be able to understand and to really engage in a way that allows us to address all of the emotions and all of the things that may have been coming up for people while they were going through that experience. But I do believe that, to your point, if we can get as proximate as possible to those lived experiences by engaging in the storytelling exercise, being vulnerable to share our own stories, as well as listen to other stories, and it certainly can help us bridge that gap. And it can be a really big difference maker. So I appreciate that. I'm watching the chat and I don't want to ignore that. The story you shared about, the gentleman asking for you to unpack his suitcase has really caught the attention of many in this community. And I agree, that would have given me pause as well. So, but yeah, those are some real scenarios that, while it may be very jarring to hear, that people are exposed to, on a daily. And so, yeah, I don't want to minimize the reactions that are coming forth into the chat. Okay, so at what point in your career did you decide that you wanted to start Reflection Point? And what did the journey to business ownership look like for you?
I just want to add to the suitcase thing. I did say no, just to make sure that nobody wondered if I packed his suitcase or not for it.
So just in case you're wondering, yeah.
Exactly. I just want to make it really clear. I had this psychological safety to say no back then. The journey to Reflection Point came, I think about 20 years into my career. And part of it came from the fact that as I was reflecting back on the things that were important to me, that this idea of lifelong learning really mattered. And that learning something new, I've been in client service my whole life, right? It's been being a lawyer, being a consultant, that the pleasure of being able to learn about what my clients are looking for, what they need, this was something that really energized me on a regular basis. But then I realized how many voices or how many people we don't get a chance to learn from, and how many people don't really have lifelong learning embedded in the nature of the work that they do. And so Reflection Point was really born of this idea that if we can learn more about each other, and if we can learn more from people who have a lot of life experience that I believe is a form of personal wisdom that is different than ours, then it only enriches us all. It enriches us individually, it enriches us as teams, and it also enriches us as organizations. And so that was the gist of the work. We started about 12 years ago. Nice. And it's been a learning journey of its own, right? Because when you talk to a leader and you say, I'm going to bring a story and a facilitator into your organization, and people can talk to each other across hierarchies, across functions, and within teams. Often they will they'll look at you and raise an eyebrow. But I think being tenacious about it has been an important part of the journey.
No, that's great. And I think that storytelling has garnered a lot of attention, of late in the most recent years, that people are a bit more open to the idea of storytelling as a way to, build bridges. And so I would imagine that probably you're getting, fewer eyebrows to raise when those conversations or those invitations are being entertained. I love that you talked about the continuous learning. And what I have seen in my space, and you probably have seen this too, is that with the clients we work with at NWC, those who have better ability to have impact from some of the learning experiences that are being offered through different modalities is because they have already adopted and embedded into their culture this learning, continual learning type of mentality. And so the connection point there has been very evident to me, and the fact that you brought it to the conversation, I just wanted to amplify that. So I want to talk, as we stay here on Reflection Point, I want to talk about collective intelligence, right? I was not familiar with that language until kind of, reading some of your work and following your work. But your organization, you really build very intentionally on building inclusive and collaborative teams, but you do that by strengthening what you refer to as collective intelligence. So let's unpack that. What is collective intelligence and why is it important to the workplace?
Absolutely. So collective intelligence is actually a scientifically validated idea. There's lots of research out there on what it means. And it's really looking at whether or not there are factors that can determine whether a group of people can solve a challenge or tackle a problem together better than another group of people. It's very close to IQ if you think about it, right? IQ, whether you believe in it or not, is a measure that dictates whether or not, that engages or that helps you to understand whether somebody's able to solve a problem. What I love about collective intelligence, though, is that unlike IQ, it's not about being smart. So the most collectively intelligent teams are not the teams of people that are the smartest brought together, or where, like in school where there's one smart person who does all the work. Really, the most collectively intelligent teams are the ones who work better together. It's all about the connective tissue between the members of the team, and it doesn't really have to do with the intelligence of the team members themselves. And I love this idea because it means that you can take teams, very diverse teams with very different kinds of backgrounds, and if you can strengthen the connective tissue that holds them together, then you can make unstoppable teams. And I think that this is a really important thing to think about. Companies tend not to think about investing in the spaces between people, and yet it's very much in the spaces between people that the gems, the real power exists. And so based on that science, we've done a lot of research and a lot of looking at, well, what does collective intelligence look like if you go to try to build it, right? Yeah. So for us, collective intelligence is really a very intentional set of 5 skills that include listening with humility, asking good and curious questions, like really good questions, not gotcha questions that prove what you already know, but questions that are willing to show people that you don't know. The third is challenging your assumptions. And it gets back to what we talked about before on flipping perspectives. You have to be willing to flip your perspective before you're going to. The fourth is disagreeing with respect and without retribution. And that's, I think, where psychological safety comes in. We hear a lot about psychological safety in the workplace. And the fifth is widening the circle of empathy, because I think despite all our best intentions, what we know about empathy is that we tend to feel empathy for people who look like us or people that we know. And so by broadening the circle of people that we know, it really helps us to be far more understanding and far more willing to have each other's backs, right? So
that is so rich. I love that. That is so rich. And so it sounds like part of the value and the power here is really finding that common ground, those common values where respect and humanity is kind of centered in order for collective intelligence to really have the optimized output that I know that it's intended. And what's interesting to me, Anne, and you may have received this question before, but oftentimes when we think about diversity, we think about people with difference coming together, then it's not uncommon for people to realize that in those differences can also exist conflict because of the difference. And I love that what collective intelligence helps to refute is that very point. It's not just about diversity in and of itself, it is effective management of that difference and that diversity. And part of managing it, it sounds like from what you just shared, is finding that common ground, finding those value sets, and then addressing, those 5 key pillars that you mentioned. That is very much aligned with this whole collective intelligence perspective. And so that was just really rich. I wanted to kind of round out what I was hearing to make sure that I'm tracking with you.
No, and you are. I think it's also really important to know that it's not only managing the diversity, but also leveraging diversity, right? Because there's research in this collective intelligence space in the academy that shows that diverse teams do struggle, right? Because there's so inherent difference. Right. People see things in very different ways. But if you can build the social sensitivity, if you can have the balanced turn taking, if you can really honor the diversity that's in the team, which is inherently a part of collective intelligence, then diverse teams do even better. And so it's really powerful to enable us to not only make diverse teams, bring them to the table, but actually allow them to actually have real impact, because we're allowing that diversity to really influence and affect the decisions that we make in business every day.
Yeah, no, I love that. So I'm watching the chat and I want to, bring forth some of the comments that the community here is sharing. So Tracy has added, and by the way, Tracy, thank you for the introduction. Anne is here because you recommended her, but she says collective intelligence is inclusive intelligence. I would agree with that. Alfred Ramirez says he wanted to bring up transferable skills from life experiences and coupling them with other learning, which goes back to when we were talking about, again, people's lived experiences and how the value of that. And then collective intelligence is a way that is different from groupthink. Yes, Alfred, I appreciate that. When we're all thinking alike, we're not really thinking. That's what groupthink is. And so I love that collective intelligence really helps to amplify that intelligence. And now those aha moments is not because we all agree. It is about how we leverage, again, to your point, those differences to make sure that the output is as strong as it possibly can be. And so lots of other good stuff that's happening into the chat. Before we move on from collective intelligence, I want to make sure that we capture for this community those 5 key pillars once again. And so I'm going to ask my team that as I kind of regurgitate and you correct me if I don't have the language precisely right, and that we place them into the chat. So I heard listening with humility. I love that. I also heard asking good questions. That one really gave me pause because I talk often about how I think that as a society, we spend way too much time making definitive statements and not nearly enough time being curious and asking thoughtful questions. So I love that one, asking thoughtful questions, challenging assumptions. I think that's really important as well. Interrogating, why is this coming up for me? What does this mean? Am I assuming positive intent here, right? So I like that, challenging assumptions, and then disagree with respect. That's key because, again, there is value in healthy conflict, right? And so if we can't disagree respectfully, then people are not going to feel a sense of safety and bringing forth different perspectives. And so I love that one too, disagree with respect. And then the last one, widening our sense of empathy. Am I saying these all correctly? Okay, I love those.
Circle, but sense is good too, because I think it's all about expanding, right?
Yeah, I love that. Okay, no, that's awesome. That's fantastic. Okay. So I want to thank you. My colleague has placed those into the chat. So thank you so very much. So I want to lean a little bit more into this notion of storytelling. We've already kind of referenced that that's a really big part of your messaging platform and how you show up to this work. So let's talk a little bit more about why storytelling is essential, specifically when you're building teams and strengthening existing teams, because there are some people that are of the persuasion. My personal stories is my personal life. I don't want to bring that into the workplace. And so I'm not going to go there. How do you reconcile those who have that thought process?
Well, I think if you were to get a group of people together and say, okay, everybody tell your story, it's awkward on a good day and disastrous on a bad, right? So I think one of the things that makes Reflection Point so magical is that we start in a story that we share with everybody. And it's usually a piece of literature. It's a really high quality short story. It's always narrative. It's not an article or a podcast. It's not a how-to piece. It's always a story. It can be old, it can be new. One of the things I love is that we can show the very contemporary nature of a 100-year-old story, but we can also bring forth voices that people don't read in school. So it brings diversity to the equation. So we start in a story. And the reason we do that is that stories are an incredible way of leveling the playing field, right? So if you want your CEO to speak to somebody who's on the front line, there are very few things that they can share in common where they can speak to each other human to human, but a story will do that. A story enables them to leave their expertise at the door, engage with each other authentically and in a balanced way. And what stories also do is they invite us to step into the shoes of a character. They highlight things that we recognize or find relevant from our own personal stories. And then it enables you to share the part of your story that you might be willing to share, right? We're not asking everybody to bear everything, but we're saying, maybe there's something in this story that really resonates with you, the actions of a character, a particular experience. So stories tend to invite the sharing of those stories by others. And before you know it, the story morphs and changes based on people's perspectives and the conversation that ensues. And so for me, those stories become this incredible platform and jumping off point, but more importantly, they're a really safe place to practice, right? So the 5 skills that I teach you about, they really are important in the workplace.
Yeah.
I didn't learn those skills in school. I'm assuming that you didn't have classes in those skills in school. So we need to find places and spaces that we can take the risk down, but create spaces where we can practice, or we can disagree. And we will intentionally pick stories that will, cause some disagreement or create some ambiguity. And it gives people practice in some really meaningful ways.
I love that. I love that. It reminds me, Anne, of an experience that we did at NWC, where as part of a learning experience, we opened it up with this impromptu storytelling exercise where we gave kind of the first liner, and then everyone else had to build the story by adding on to it. And then we had like this, story that encompassed so many different thoughts and perspectives of this collective team. And it was quite an exercise, but it certainly did a lot of what you mentioned. It helped people to flip perspectives. Well, I didn't even think about that as being a direction to take this story, but that must be something that you align with, or maybe something that you've experienced. And so it was really interesting. So let's talk about how leaders can coach their teams and using the power of storytelling and conversation to share more about themselves, and to do so to help build camaraderie, to help build a sense of community with their coworkers. What are some of those strategies that you often coach leaders around to do that?
So I think probably the most important strategy for leaders is first and foremost to model it, right? If a leader really wants an open and thoughtful and sharing team, then they're going to have to be open and thoughtful and sharing as well, right? And I think the leaders who do this work the most successfully are the ones, and we actually had a client, a president of an organization, that used to say, it helps us to separate our ideas from our egos, right? And I think if you have a leader who's willing to say, I'm going to put my ego aside and really engage to get to know people, it really matters, right? It really helps people become more authentic. When I did my doctoral work on organizational learning, a big chunk of it was about how leaders use conversation. And one of the things that I discovered in the research was that many leaders will say, oh, I get a group together and we have a conversation. I'm looking for ways to help shape this strategy, and I'm looking for ideas to emerge. But what really happens is they go in and they say, here are the 3 things that I think we have to do, and I'm looking for validation for those ideas.
Oh, yeah.
What they know is the right thing to do and what they actually do is not always the same. And so I think one of the things that leaders need to do is to check whether or not their own intention is an intention of learning and growing and engaging with people. And then they have to open their minds to where these ideas can come from. I mean, it's not a hierarchy. Ideas don't fall into a hierarchy. And we see this in Reflection Point all the time, that sometimes the most insightful idea, well, rarely does the most insightful idea come from the person with the biggest education or the highest sort of job category in the room. Right. It tends to come from the places where you least expect it. And so people can see that there are really amazing ideas residing in corners of your workplace that you're not even thinking about, and they create a space for those ideas to come forth. Well, then you only amplify and grow the possibilities, right? So I think for leaders, the most advice is participate, don't make this something other people do, and model and be a little bit vulnerable. Share something, share your own mistakes, share the things that you wish you could have done differently now that you're older and wiser, and invite others to do the same.
Yeah, participate, model, show vulnerability, and open the door and the space for others to feel safe in sharing their ideas. Yeah, as you were talking about the validation piece, I don't know if that's the same as like confirmation bias, but it does show up quite often, and I think that leaders, and I've done it myself several times, but I think that as leaders, sometimes we feel like we need to have at least a foundation upon which others then can build upon. But, what you're saying is sometimes there's great value and power in just quietening the ego altogether and letting the ideas kind of organically surface from those in which you are engaging. So I love that. I mentioned when I was giving your bio, sharing your bio, that we both work for or write for Forbes, both are Forbes contributors, and you have a recent Forbes article that you wrote that touches on companies building diverse teams, and you talk specifically about the importance of investing in psychological safety when you're building those diverse teams. And so, what are some ways that you have seen that companies are really prioritizing psych safety and making it core to how in which teams are interacting and producing outcomes?
Yeah. It's interesting. Psychological safety still makes a little bit people's hair stand on end a little bit. I'm always amazed when people say, well, psychological, that doesn't belong in the workplace, right? So I think the companies that, or the leaders that are doing a good job are the ones that are speaking to it, that are saying, psychological safety is important to us. And it's important to us because it's really fundamentally a driver of learning, right? So for an organization that wants to be a learning organization, that wants to innovate, that wants to grow, that wants to expand, then you can't do that without psychological safety.
Right.
It's not about empowering people to say things that are hurtful and mean and then protecting them in the process, right? It's not that. It's not also about being super nice and caring and not speaking up when somebody makes a mistake. There's a frightful study that I often quote when I talk about psychological safety. A study was done that said that 90% of nurses would not speak up to a doctor and tell them that they're doing something wrong, even if a patient's life is at risk. 90% of nurses.
Yeah.
Right? For all of us that have been in a situation where there's a nurse and a doctor, if that's the case, it's really, really, really scary. And it gets to all of the ways in which industries and their hierarchies and their compliance and all the things that they do can actually speak against psychological safety. So I think the organizations that do this well are the ones that say it's about learning. We're going to try really hard to suspend the hierarchies and to create opportunities for people to speak to each other in different ways, such that they can learn that it's okay to make a mistake. They celebrate making mistakes. They create learning meetings instead of decision meetings. They find ways to invite people and then to celebrate the times that people give an alternative perspective that may not necessarily be what a leader is looking for. But when they learn something that they're not looking for, they learn something very powerful. It's very easy to tell a leader what they want to know. It's much harder to tell a leader what they don't want to know. And those that make themselves available for that are the ones that are really making a concerted effort to build the psychological safety in their organizations.
So much that you shared in that. Again, I love language, so I pay attention to words, and I love how you phrased, learning meetings versus decision meetings. And we are always trying to solve, and what in our, intent to solve, we're trying to make decisions. But I love, coming to those meetings and really setting the tone that we're not making decisions right now. We're learning, and we want everyone to share. I think that's really important. And as you were talking about psych safety, I think this community probably is familiar with Amy Edmondson, who actually coined the phrase and did a lot of work around it. And it has now, while it started from a healthcare, perspective, it now has become this really big phenomenon that all types of organizations are really trying to center as part of creating that sense of belonging. Lots is happening into the chat, and there's someone in the community that just asked about questions, and so I will be transitioning momentarily to take questions from the audience for our guest co-host today. And you can present your question and let us know that you're interested in doing so by using the raise hand feature if you're part of this Zoom virtual community, or if you're on LinkedIn Live, you can place your question into the comments, and my team is going to be pulling those into our Zoom community so that we can also make sure those questions are a part of our conversation with the time that we have left. And so I will give you an opportunity to think about maybe some of the curiosities you're holding while I go to the next question. But again, just make sure that if you're interested, you let us know. We'll be more than happy to bring you into the conversation. So I want to talk now about the consequences of companies who view inclusion as a program or an initiative instead of as something that needs to be fully embedded, fully integrated and operationalized and non-negotiable in terms of working together. And right now, I know that there are many organizations as they find themselves really trying to brace for the uncertainty of the economy, they're pulling those budgets away. And so what are you saying to those organizations right now, Anne?
Well, I think this is a crisis that we're seeing, that because we framed inclusion, and it goes back quite a ways, even from fairly well-intended individuals, we framed inclusion as a social activity, a social imperative, and not a business imperative. And I think that by separating it from business, we made it an initiative, we made it an event, but we made it extracurricular, and we made it excisable as soon as economic exigencies meant that we didn't have time or money to focus on those things. And that is really a tragedy. But if you think about these skills of collective intelligence, which I believe in my heart fully are the ways in which we can create the most inclusive teams, these are also the ways in which we can build the most collaborative teams and the most innovative teams. Because at the end of the day, inclusion is a non-negotiable part of working together. It's not some of us are in, but we're not all in. You know, we're going to take the opinions of some, but not the opinions of others. We're going to take the perspective of some and not the perspective of others. If we operate that way, we'll never be successful. And so if we think about inclusion less as an initiative on the side that can be excised and more as a fundamental piece of effective collaboration and effective growth, then if we cut inclusion and we cut diversity programs, then we're making a huge, really existential mistake in the future of our organizations. I think that's the piece that we have to be focused on. I think it's really to make inclusion something extra is to make it into something that it shouldn't be. It needs to be, it's the heartbeat of the organization.
Yeah, it is. It's the core, it's the heartbeat. I love how you put that. It goes back to what you said before, where we're accustomed to having a lot of, decision meetings and not enough learning meetings. And I think that where organizational leaders can help ensure that there is a strong commitment to the work of DEI, even in this type of space where there's a lot of economic uncertainty, is that it needs to begin with the learning meeting to understand where is there consensus around the value set of this? How are we all defining those terms? How do we see this manifesting itself in our organization? And letting those conversations to help inform the guiding principles of how in which now this is going to show up throughout the organization. And then you follow it up with a decision meeting to really land on that and say, okay, this is how we know that this is really happening the way that we intend for it to. And that's part of really aligning on what are those non-negotiables versus what are those areas where we really can feel like it's okay for us to kind of lean into the both and recognizing the nuances there. So really good discussion. So there's a question that's in the chat, and I'm probably not pronouncing this name correctly, but I think it is Michelet. But thanks so much for your question. And here is what the question is. Can we talk a bit more about safety? As a leader, I found people exit conversations with me or other colleagues because they say they don't feel safe. By this, what's clear from a generation younger than mine is by safety. So she's asking, what does safety mean exactly? These folks seem to mean that they feel disagreed with and that makes them feel uncomfortable. Great question. So what would you say to that, Dr. Ann?
Well, I wonder if that is the underlying issue there is a safety issue or truly an inability to disagree. I think we're living in a society right now where disagreement is so galvanizing, right? We talk about cancel culture. We have so linked how we define our identities to what it is that we believe, that when somebody gives us something that challenges what we believe, it challenges our very existence. It challenges our very identity. And I worry that we have allowed ourselves to get to a place where, because we don't practice disagreement that doesn't have horrific consequences, we have enabled people to say, oh, I can't hear that because I don't agree, right?
Yeah.
Not I believe that when I see it, it's I see it when I believe it, right? People don't believe something, they don't want to see that there's something else out there. And so I think that if we frame it as safety, we end the conversation. If we frame it as opening the opportunity to practice disagreement and to learn new skills for us to be able to open ourselves up to something else, then we might be able to expand the problem. I think it's not an overnight solution, right? It's not a one and done. It's one of the reasons, to your point, Nika, that inclusion isn't just an event, right? You can't fix that in a single event. You have to continually sort of practice that muscle of engaging and disagreeing and realizing that, your point and my point may not align, but it could create something even more powerful together.
Absolutely. Yeah. Building up that muscle so that it becomes easier when you find yourself, confronted with the need to pull out those superpowers and those skill sets as you're navigating those conversations. You said earlier that psych safety is not about, the niceties of helping people just feel all warm and fuzzy, right? It's not coddling. And so what comes up for me as I think about this question is maybe sometimes people on the receiving end, that's what they're seeking. And so I think that bringing clarity to, we need to speak truth to power. We need to do it respectfully. We need to not just tell people what we think they want to hear in that moment. And it's something that I know we have at NWC really tried to embed into our culture. One of our core values is constructive candor. For that very reason, we all need to be able to name the hard things, talk about the hard things. And where I am learning and growing, and this goes back to some of what you shared, Anne, is that sometimes I think the resistance to the feedback is in those times where maybe leaders don't know what to do with that information. Maybe it's because they feel like, I don't have any control to change that, so why are we talking about it? But what I have come to understand is that there's a lot of power in the acknowledgement of it and giving people the space to name it. Even if nothing can't be done, it's like you're empathizing with them around and validating that it's something that they're holding, right? So wanted to offer that. Yeah, go ahead.
And I think you hit on something really important, and that is that we need to learn how to be uncomfortable sometimes, right? Because it's
Yes.
only through our discomfort that we challenge ourselves to learn new things. And so if we use safety as a shield, and sometimes even as a weapon, to keep ourselves from having to confront things that make us uncomfortable, then we're not going to learn and grow, right? We're
not going to learn and grow. Yeah.
We're not going to really move the needle on issues of diversity and inclusion, on challenging issues of, what do we do with AI, and how do we think about the world in a world full of pandemics and climate change? There's a lot of big problems that are going on. And we aren't going to be able to figure out how to solve those problems unless we really rock our souls and try to figure out what is it that makes us uncomfortable and how can we get past that together.
I know. I see your hand, Lynn-Ward. I'm coming to you in just a second. I want to make this point really quickly because you touched on it, Anne. That discomfort is something that is a big barrier and hurdle for a lot of organizations. And what I mean by that is it is pretty routine that often when we are engaged in partnering with clients, part of their angst and their anxiety around the journey ahead has everything to do with, well, people in our organization, they're really uncomfortable about this topic. They just don't know. And so their disposition is, we need to help them feel comfortable. We need to help bring them along in a way that doesn't allow them to feel, isolated, and that becomes hard because of the very reason that you said. We need that some level of that discomfort in order for us to really be able to create some type of change that can be impactful. And so just wanted to share that.
After the murder of George Floyd, we had a lot of people come to us and say, can you bring us stories about race? Can you share something? But here's what we'd like. We want something about race. We want it to really be trenchant. We want it to really show the inequities, but could it be cheerful?
Does it have to be so doom and gloom? Does it have to be real?
Right, exactly. So yeah, we're going to make it. Anyway, those would often leave me somewhat speechless.
No, I'm with you on that. So I brought Lynn Roy Jones into the spotlight. It's good to see you, friend. Thanks for being here. You're one of our repeat community members, and so we're always grateful. But share your comment or questions at this time.
It's great to be here, and you're actually well into the direction that I wanted to just go a little bit in this particular area. And when you talked about it coming up, and then the weapon, using as a weapon. And so you're already started that. It's been so a rich conversation listening to, and now getting into some of the questions. And I'm just loving the chat also, the discomfort equals growth. And we can always assume that someone is saying they don't feel safe, that it's always being used as always being used as a weapon.
Yeah.
And my question really was getting to that. And it's been such a solution-driven conversation today, which is great. To how do you help people? Are you seeing any of the research at all that really gets into this to let people know that, hey, we are aware of what you're doing? Because careers have been derailed because someone said, I don't feel safe. And it was a weaponized type of situation versus really that they didn't feel, they knew exactly what they were doing, because that backs off the person. It freezes them, it immobilizes. It's very debilitating when someone says that, but that's the reality that has been going on for some time now. It's like the days when someone said you were a racist, that would immobilize that person, when you really need to have a sincere, candid conversation about the behavior that the person is exhibiting versus just trying to push back the person. So anything in terms of research, I'm interested in, just if you tapped into that. But I love the positivity and the solution-driven conversation today. It is, and it's not that it's not been done, but in particular about this, these 5 pillars and how you need to do it. And the last thing I'll just add, and then turn it back over to you to respond, is that I'm just convinced that we really need to not just say leadership, but we need to really talk about and emphasize being inclusive leaders. That's what we need.
Yeah. And I think leaders at all levels too, right? Because I think we think of leaders, we assume there's going to be a CEO or a senior leader who solves all the problems. And I think in many ways we tend to overestimate what a leader can do. And when a leader leaves, the things that they've done go away if we give it too much to that individual leader. But to get back to your question, which I think is a really interesting one, Lenroy, I can't think of research off the top of my head, but I will do a little bit of digging. And if I can find something, then I can get it to you through Nika and the Intentional Conversations team. But I do think that this weaponization of psychological safety is a problem. I don't think it was ever intended that way. I don't think Amy Edmondson intends it that way. And she's written quite a few things to say, this is not, it's not saving you from discomfort. It's not saving you from having to do the hard work. It's not saving your job, right? I mean, she's literally written to say, it's not going to protect you from a layoff. That's not psychological safety. But I think if we frame these things in terms of how we can learn, and it's interesting. We just recently this week had a working session, a learning session with a bunch of our facilitators, because we facilitate these conversations about stories. And one of the facilitators was sharing a comment that somebody made. This is a story that we used. It's a young Ethiopian writer. Her name is Maren Hedero. Her work is incredible. And she wrote a book called sorry, I can't remember the title, but it has to do with 2 young Ethiopian women who come to America and they're trying to make their way. And it's called a down-home meal for these difficult times. And they use cooking and their friendship, and they use sort of what they have in common, where they've come from and then where they're going. And they use all this to create tremendous friendship. And somebody in the group that they were facilitating talked about the fact that they were surprised that these Ethiopian women showed up in America with shoes, because they thought that they'd be so poor that they wouldn't have any shoes, right? So immediately the hackles got on the back of this person's neck, and she thought, oh, wait a minute, maybe this person is making a statement or a comment or showing a bias that's really dangerous. But I've been reflecting on it since the conversation came up, and it made me realize that this person, by having the honesty to say, oh, I was really surprised that these 2 Ethiopian women were wealthy in Ethiopia and poor in America, and not poor in Ethiopia, and therefore they were coming to save themselves here, that it was a perspective flip, Nika, that really helped them to see that maybe the world that they were envisioning was wrong. And this question or this comment that they made may have not been articulated in a perfect way, but it opened the conversation to the fact that they had seen something differently, and then others could come in and say, well, maybe there's another way to think about this. And all of a sudden you're having a real conversation. So to me, that's a sign of safety, that somebody can actually make a mistake and realize, okay, the others are going to have my back. And we try really hard when we facilitate to enable those things to happen and to play out, because none of us is born with the ability to say the perfect thing that will never offend anybody, right? And we're always going to back our way into something that we don't mean quite the way we said it the first time. But if we give people a chance to say it the second time, or to think about it a different way, or to be guided by a colleague or by a peer in a non-threatening situation, then I'm hoping that one of the things that we can do is de-weaponize this idea of, oh my God, it's not safe anymore because somebody said something that I'm not sure whether I'm supposed to hear that or learn about it. And I certainly can't say anything, So it's a messy business. And the messiness is what makes it uncomfortable, but I think it's also what makes it so powerful and important.
Thanks so much, Lynn Roy. And
Thank you.
and Amy
Thank
and
you.
Anne, if you do find some additional resources, Lynn Roy did share his LinkedIn, but we're also happy to distribute it to this community as well. So thanks so much for being here. I'm so glad that we were able to touch on the weaponization of psych safety, because I don't think that's a conversation that we have enough.
Yeah.
And I too see it every single day. And I think that it has created part of what many will say DEI is not working, it's not effective, it's a distraction, we need to get rid of it. It's because of all the misinformation that people are now consuming about some of these terms that are surfacing as part of the broad, DEI conversation. So in the chat, Tracy says we need to understand the nuance between discomfort and trauma. And that really spoke to me because yes, we, even that is a word that's tossed around very freely these days. I'm traumatized, and I don't want to, minimize the fact that there are a lot of people who really are dealing with some serious, trauma.
Right.
But I also believe that it is important as we have these conversations to help appeal to people the need for interrogating what those feelings are to make sure that it is being understood in the right way. Sometimes it is just, I'm uncomfortable because, this was very constructive and it didn't feel good in the moment. And it's, and so anyway, I think that that's a really big conversation that I'm glad has surfaced today.
I think one of the things I'd love to just add to that point before we move on is
Sure.
that when we anonymize things, when we talk about things in a concept over here, it's very easy to be critical and uncomfortable and, oh, we can't go there. But the second it's eyeball to eyeball and people are engaged with each other in an interpersonal way, I think it fundamentally changes the dynamic, right? And I love you mentioned at the outset that you have a speaker who's coming to talk about whole person diversity. I think that's exactly the right direction that DEI needs to go right now, that we need to be thinking about what are the interpersonal ways that we can explore the diversity of our experiences, our expertise, our understanding, our points of view, as opposed to how do we think about this thing as a monolithic topic on the silver screen that we can watch, but we don't have to engage with, right? And I think if we watch and don't have to engage, then it's very easy to say, all right, I'm engaging with this, but I'm not engaging with that. But if we're talking to somebody one-on-one, you don't have that choice in the same way. And I think it's time that we really prioritize the interpersonal and not the anonymous.
I agree. Don't you think, though, that the remote nature of work these days, though, makes that a bit more complex? I mean, do you think that that has a lot to do with maybe why this is not a concept that people are gravitating to, maybe to the degree in which people like me and yourself are really hoping for? Could it be that distributed workforce factor? I mean, granted, I can look you eye to eye now, but I do believe that maybe that has impacted how in which people are finding opportunities to really have that interpersonal relationship to be cultivated.
I think it is a factor, but I also think it's not easy whether you're in person or you're in a digital setting, that it always requires a different kind of effort to sort of go to places that are a little bit more uncomfortable or that are not the norm. And I do think it takes just a little bit of extra effort, right? So we find before March of 2020, Reflection Point had never been virtual ever. In fact, I thought in February of 2020, I would have told you it's impossible, right? By April of 2020, we said, okay, it can't be impossible, or else we hang our hats up, right?
Right.
So we started to try. And I'll tell you what's really interesting about the virtual space of Zoom is that you and I are as close together as if we were sitting across a small Starbucks table, right? And when you add 10 people and 12 people and 15 people, there's that eyeball to eyeball feeling is really strong, right? When you're sitting in a room and there's somebody who's playing with their phone under the table and everybody's looking at the most important person in the room, they check out in different ways, right? Not necessarily the same ways, but we have the option to check out no matter where we are. And so the question is, what can we do to invite people to check in, right? So one is cameras, right? Cameras are huge. And I was so excited when people put your cameras on, because you would never walk into a conference room in an office and put a bag over your head, but we walk into video conferences all the time and turn off our camera. So I think there are things that people have to just sort of condition themselves to do, to say the landscape is different and we have to make a different kind of effort.
Absolutely. Dr. Ann, this has been so enlightening. We're getting to the top of the hour, and I want to give you the final 60 seconds or so to first and foremost make sure that you are receiving our gratitude for you being here today. We have shared a lot of your information in today's chat, so I hope that you all will find the time to connect with Dr. Ann and her content and, reflection point. Your LinkedIn information is also placed there. But I want to give you the final few seconds just to close this out in whatever way that feels appropriate. If there's something that you're holding that you didn't get a chance to socialize and you want us to know, I want to give you that opportunity.
I thank you very much. I think that the most important thing is I know that what we do is a little bit unorthodox, by bringing in a facilitated discussion of a story to places where people are incredibly busy and they've got a lot going on. And I just want to say it's really important that we honor and celebrate the diverse voices in all of our organizations, even in the organizations that don't look on their face to be as diverse as they could. There's still a tremendous diversity of perspective and opinion. And I think taking moments like Reflection Point or other ways to engage with people interpersonally is really huge. I would love to invite anybody who's at all interested to reach out to me. We do no strings attached demos where you can join a conversation and we'll send you a story and you can participate and see what it feels like. We would love to share the story of sharing stories more broadly, and would love to engage with any and all of you that would be interested in doing that. So thank you very much.
Share the story of sharing stories. Thank you so very much, Dr. Ann. And thank you to all of you who've joined us here today. I hope you have a lovely, safe, and wonderful weekend. Again, happy Cinco de Mayo. And we look forward to seeing you back here next week for Intentional Conversations Vodcast. Thank you all. Bye-bye.